With the advent of modern LLMs like ChatGPT and Gemini, society as a whole has come to experience the next big boom in the AI field. Some people are speaking to it as if it's a real person, and the shutdown of GPT 4.0 has revealed the deep roots it has established in those communities. But this isn't the first time people have grown to love a fictional being, or even the first time people have loved a neural network. I'm going to bring you back to 1996, one of the earliest times when people were given access to AI creatures, and then others immediately went on to torture them. This is Creatures, a game released in 1996. In this game, you manage some animals called Norns. These Norns need to be fed and protected from monsters called Grendels, and could actually learn from how you raise them. This was done with a neural network, not unlike neural networks we use today, except of course much smaller in scale. They only had 952 neurons by default, making up various lobes of their artificial brains. These would take in stimuli, such as things they see or needs they have, and come to a decision on what to do from there. For comparison's sake, ChatGPT had 175 billion artificial neurons back in 2023. These numbers don't directly scale to human intelligence. The human brain has fewer than 175 billion neurons, but is still smarter in many ways than even ChatGPT today. It more serves as a reference point for how new their implementation was, yet still pioneering for tech of the time. The person behind this game was Steve Gran, who's also known for creating a monster. I have no other words to describe this thing. Made several years after Creatures, this was Lucy, an android running on software to emulate human brain neurons. Lucy's big trick was having access to a very subtle digital camera in its eye, which sends footage to its 50,000 neurons. With these 50,000 neurons, Lucy is capable of telling apart a banana from an apple on a good day. Steve's goal with Creatures and eventually Lucy was to simulate, at least in small part, a human brain. When Creatures was given to the public, people were very impressed with the gameplay. At the time, this sort of creature-raising simulation was not common. The closest was a Tamagotchi, and that was programmed in a much more traditional way than Norns were in Creatures, and they could not learn. The game was also surprisingly flexible for the time. Each individual Norn was actually a file that could be shared with other players, named breeders for how they raised generations of Norns, and could give them away like real creatures. These files held a lot of things, including the specific training ingrained in a Norn from its breeder. You could influence the behavior of a Norn by tickling it to encourage the behavior more, or by slapping it to discourage that behavior. This was just one part of how Norns operated. Their behaviors all stem from their underlying neural network. Unlike something like a sim, where it has the code directly telling it to go and pathfind when hungry, the neural network would build this instruction from base parts. The Norn would take in the stimulus of being hungry alongside the location of food, and then its brain would tell it to go eat that food. This distinction is important because it allows for complex interactions, such as attempting to sate hunger with junk foods. These foods decrease the hunger drive in their brains, but did not break down into the glucose needed to survive, allowing Norns to die of malnutrition even when not hungry. The Norns could even learn language, and would do so by being taught words from a computer. These words have no inherent meaning programmed in, much like Norn behaviors. The meanings of these words were meant to be manually taught by exposing a young Norn to it while it looked at an object. It would then learn to associate that word to the object, and would eventually become capable of putting that word together with verbs to do specific behaviors. Because of this teaching system, the specific words only existed as nouns and verbs you could assign any meaning to, and you could even make up your own words to take the place of the existing nouns and verbs. Part of the reason why players were called breeders was also because these creatures had a sort of DNA they could pass down. Their genetics would influence appearance, but also the behavior of a Norn by affecting its chemical drives in its brain. One Norn might greatly value sating hunger, while another Norn might value sleeping. If one breeder wanted a Norn that had specific behaviors and appearances, they could employ selective breeding by using an ugly tomato. This item reduced the sex drive of a Norn, effectively removing them from the gene pool without needing to kill them. All this formed the basis of the Norn breeder community. Players would share their Norns to share what interesting behaviors they had found or manually bred into them. Because of the internet growing more prolific at the time, it was normal for people to have their own personal sites hosting their favorite Norns for others to download. This 1997 Wired article interviews some breeders, and we get their perspective on the Norns they take care of. When asked about emotional attachment to Norns, one interviewee says this: "It's not uncommon for younger breeders to burst into tears when their first Norns die. I even got an email from a fully grown man who admitted he cried when his favorite Norn died." Another was asked about interesting behaviors they had seen in their Norns. "The most beautiful scene I recall was two Norns playing football with a carrot beetle. They kicked it, the other caught it, and they kicked it back and forth." What's notable about this is the fact that this football session, like other actions, was not programmed directly into the game. This was emergent behavior that came as a result of the neural networks in the Norns. Finally, we get to learn some of the things breeders specifically look for in the Norns. There are many answers, among them are interesting colors, high health, high intelligence, and a comprehensive comprehension of commands. This mentality made up the majority of the larger creatures community. Even if they were not specifically breeding their Norns for certain traits, they enjoyed taking care of their little creatures and watching how they learned. However, others would derive interest from more dubious behaviors. From a forum user in 1998, Norn Basher, do you beat your Norns or do other things to terrorize them? Come on, I know some of you must have some worlds dedicated just to pain for the little devils. Yes, I have a normal Norn world too, but I have one in which some Norns are tortured for the betterment of others. But I would be willing to send the HANN group some of my Norns to see if they can be rehabilitated. The HANN group they reference here is the House for Abused and Neglected Norns, a group that was dedicated to rehabilitating Norns. Rehabilitation in this context is very similar to reality. It's the act of trying to fix the behavior of a Norn and prolong its life. At this early point in the game's life, rehabilitation was generally only for Norns that had accidentally gone down a training path. The complexity of this game went over many users' heads, and this provided an opportunity for more experienced breeders to rehabilitate failed attempts to raise Norns. Some did this out of altruism in an attempt to give a better life to a Norn that was otherwise living a bad one. Others would do this as a challenge, bringing a Norn that was otherwise doomed back from the brink of death. The first reply to the thread displayed this latter intent, stating, "I also like challenges, so if you could send me your group of tortured Norns, I'd like to see if I could fix the little buggers." Further down the thread, you would find users that took more issue with the act of purposefully torturing Norns, even if it was supposedly for the betterment of others. That is just plain wrong. I mean, they're virtual, but that's just enough. No more of these tortured Norn postings or someone is going to get you. You, and anyone else into torturing Norns, are not invited to download any of my Norns from my website to use in your torture worlds. They are for the good people of this news group who are mature enough to give them proper care and attention. Later that month though, another user would pick up the momentum created by this thread. This was Anti-Norn, who birthed the Tortured Norns GeoCities site. This site is dedicated to those who torture their Norns. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please send me email. Anti-Norn. The first post on their website was a Norn simply named Slave, and they elaborated on the process they used to condition this Norn. After I created her, I started by hitting her constantly for about 5 minutes. Then I taught her all the words so it would be easier to make her scared of her surroundings. After she knew all the words, I put her in a small area with 5 Grendels. I left her there for about 20 minutes, beating her when she attempted to defend herself from the Grendels. After she was sufficiently traumatized, I put her back in the garden. In the garden, I forced her to get, look, push, and pull everything around her, all the time, constantly beating her. I made her fear running so I wouldn't have to deal with that little problem. I also forced her to eat weeds, rewarding her when she did so. At the time I exported her, she's a quivering mass of fear. She might eat, if you're lucky, but she probably won't survive long enough for food to do any good. At the time, this was easily the most comprehensive description of the torture of a Norn, and possibly the most broken Norn mentally in existence. In response to this, people of course attempted to rehabilitate the Norn as they had done many others in the past, but there had been one thing not mentioned in the description of the page. Anti-Norn hadn't just tortured this Norn, they had manually modified the Norn's genetics. Because all Norns were simply files, it was possible to edit these files using certain tools, and in turn edit their genetics more directly by bypassing breeding. Specifically, Slave had a genetic mutation that caused them to generate immense amounts of alcohol straight into their bloodstream, leaving them perpetually drunk. The community found out about this soon after downloading them. She staggers because her alcohol is maxed out. Check it in the science kit. Same for sleepiness. In the current Albia I'm running, she had one child who inherited the max alcohol, so I assume that is a mutation, though I can't find it. This mutation, alongside her reluctance to eat real food, refusal to listen to commands, fear of everything, and also starting off poisoned by mushrooms, made this one of the most difficult Norns to rehabilitate for even the most experienced players. Anti-Norn had many more of these Norns hosted on their site, although none were as famous as Slave. Out of these, the most notable ones were the ones named after other users of the forum. Here's another Norn dedicated to someone from Creatures Chat. This is Alex. This Norn's genes cause her to crave constant attention. She hates to be alone. If she's not the center of attention for a long period of time, she'll feel pain and will get sick. And much like the real Alex, she won't grow up. These creatures drew many detractors, and Anti-Norn would post their emails up on a separate page of their website. Many of these emails would threaten Anti-Norn themselves, talk about getting the page shut down, or both. At the bottom of this email page, Anti-Norn would reflect on the perceived irony in the behavior of the creature's community. Despite portraying themselves to be caring, nurturing people, they went so easily to threaten the life of a real human being. Anti-Norn also attacked their rhetoric, stating that none of these emails were written in a mature manner, although they would amend this later, mentioning they had received a few more that were more well written. They even made their way onto their own Wired interview, just a year past the previous one that had interviewed other breeders in the past. In this interview, we learned more about Auntie Norn. Outside of hosting the site, they were in their late 20s, serving in the US Navy. They also mentioned that the site was never meant to stay up for this long. The initial creation of the site was something of an experiment, meant to gauge the community reaction after seeing that thread from Nornbasher, who Auntie Norn identifies as an obvious troll for their initial post. He knew that he would be the bad guy here and was fine with the possibility, but he hadn't realized how strong the reaction would actually be. Once the first wave of responses came in, Auntie Norn found it so interesting to be the bad guy that he reconsidered his original plans to take down the website and had come up with 3 specific reasons why to keep it up. The first was that the majority of content around creatures was already positive, and so the site filled a unique niche in the community. The second was the fact that Auntie Norn saw developments around the happy breeding side of the community as stagnant, because there's nothing more to learn from creating happy Norns. And the final reason was that they wanted to provide a challenge to breeders, something known to be a motivation for rehabilitators in the community. They also described their perception of the community as a whole. Auntie Norn saw the majority of them as vindictive, hateful people who lack a firm grip on reality, although he did find appreciation in the people who actively developed their skills in an attempt to better rehabilitate his tortured Norns. The extensiveness of Auntie Norn's conditioning in their tortured Norns was causing rehabilitators to learn more about the specific mechanics of Norn behaviors. A notable example would be Slave and her genetic mutation that caused her to be persistently drunk. Auntie Norn finishes out the interview by commenting on the types of emails they've gotten. He admits he's gotten emails from fellow torturers and that some of it even creeps him out. Generally though, he finds enjoyment from the hate mail. As evident in a previous response to a question, Auntie Norn is content playing the bad guy here, and to him this sort of overreaction to the torture of a fictional creature is hilarious. From the more negative side of his inbox, Auntie Norn reveals his greatest disturbance with the emails is not the amount of death threats, but the age of his correspondence. He puts it simply, "It's actually a bit sad to see kids so full of hate." Auntie Norn would continue to update their website as more versions of creatures got released. They also released custom items that you could download and use on your Norns. One example was a crack pipe, which granted great pleasure to a Norn that used it, but would quickly rebound. The pleasure granted would be temporary, replaced with a need for more pleasure along with a desire to use the item again, creating an addiction. Groups would also get made in reaction to Auntie Norn's behaviors, such as Equal Rights for Norns, or ERFN for short. This group would attempt to get Auntie Norn's site shut down, but imploded on its own due to infighting. People in the group were getting more aggressive towards Auntie Norn, and even supposedly escalated to mail bombs. These actions were blamed on the owner of ERFN, and people went hunting for the owner of ERFN for these transgressions. However, the people hunting for the owner of ERFN had targeted an innocent person under the name Jarrett Fowler, leading the real owner of the ERFN to shut it all down after realizing the chaos they had inadvertently created. Auntie Norn wouldn't end up shut down by anyone and would eventually vanish from the community for reasons unknown. One of the last relevant posts was an article in the Home Creatures site, a popular news feed for the Creatures community at the time. He starts off by asking the audience, if you truly believe that Norns are alive and have feelings, or like to think that they do because it's fun, how can you truly define what Norn torture is? He then gives 3 long scenarios, out of which I will only give a detailed summary of one due to their sheer length. However, I will more quickly summarize the later ones, as they all contribute to a singular point. The first scenario describes a boy, Billy, who lives a blissful life at home. He has a loving family at home, and when he goes out, he enjoys hanging out with his friends at school, playing, or going to the movies. While his life is not perfect, he is happy to know that they will always be there for him. But one day, Billy is taken out of this world. Unknowingly, he had been taken and duplicated by godlike beings, put into a list of many others like him, and was chosen like produce in a grocery store. When he comes back into consciousness, he's no longer at home. His friends and family are gone. The world looks similar, but has nothing he remembers. When he attempts to approach strangers, they shout and throw rocks, and Billy has to run away. This, alongside the 2 other scenarios, are not too subtle jabs at the community that had grown so negative towards him, and the actions they took both in and out of the game. Billy's scenario is most directly commenting on what people do when they share Norns, raising a Norn in a happy life only to leave them to others in worlds that are not their own. These Norns may have been happy, but to the breeders, they were items fit to be picked and chosen for their own enjoyment. The second scenario has a couple that uses serums to both have and raise their children, forcing their children into perpetual happiness and hungerlessness with these serums, as they remain proud of how good parents they are for it. This scenario attacked the way much of the community would play the game, using custom items similar to the crack pipe Auntie Norn had made. Unlike the crack pipe, however, These custom items were to artificially boost the performance of their Norns while proclaiming how happy their world was. The final scenario introduces a kid, Ricky, who didn't enjoy playing with cars like his peers, but because of this, he would end up ostracized, getting constant threats against his life for not following the steps of everyone around him. The scenario ends with the kid getting kidnapped and tortured by his peers who saw him as different. The scenario, like the other two, was not subtle about its intentions. However, this one focused on Anti-Norn's experience as the bad guy. While Anti-Norn had said he was fine with taking this position in the community, they clearly had problems with the extreme response they constantly got, when in reality they were just playing the game differently than others were. This was possibly why they ended up leaving the community, as many people emailing him had chosen to prioritize the feelings of a fictional being over the human life that was right there on the other end of that email. Anti-Norn's influence would end up so large that it even reached the creator of Creatures, Steve Gran, who gave his thoughts when asked about Norn cruelty. One Creatures fan started a website entirely devoted to the ways in which people could be cruel to these creatures. He devised various tortures to make their little lives a misery, and I think he did so with his tongue firmly in his cheek and a challenging grin on his face. I was so pleased about this because it forced people to think about whether this was really cruel. I expected him to elicit some response from the other creatures' owners, but not quite such a hostile one as ensued. The poor guy received an enormous amount of hate mail and was excluded from the creatures' internet community for a long time. Much of his hate mail showed a greater regard for the creatures than it did for the life of this one human being. Less dramatically, I was pleased to see people start up websites of their own in response, setting them up as rehab centers and adoption agencies to provide shelter for the poor victims of this virtual abuse. This was not the behavior of people who had felt that life had been debased by the existence of artificial beings, nor was it the behavior of people who were scared of artificial intelligence. These people were going out of their way to protect and care for these creatures, and they held them in equal regard to other more natural forms of life. They may have been overreacting, but I was glad of the sentiment. As modern neural networks push their way into society today, you can think of many parallels to the Norns of the 2000s. For instance, the way people will mold them into certain patterns, how people will share files and prompts to spread specific trained behaviors, and most notably, the way some people will treat them as equals to themselves. Whether this means there will be another rising of an anti-Norn, however, is yet to be seen.